The history of astronautics is studded with well-known disasters. However, the casuistry is so vast that it allows a rational subdivision of the episodes into at least three categories: disasters predicted, but which did not occur, disasters narrowly avoided, and disasters that actually occurred and were then kept secret. To begin with, the greatest catastrophe among those announced and never happened is that of the absence of gravity that would have proved fatal for the human organism. Certain doctors of the time, says astronaut Gordon Cooper, weren't even sure if it was possible to sleep in space. Furthermore, they didn't know if a man having woken up would be able to fully regain his senses. In 1958, the National Research Council Committee in Bioastronautics made all sorts of apocalyptic predictions, even contradictory ones. In space, astronauts would fall victim to euphoria or depression. Their hearts would go crazy or stop. They wouldn't be able to urinate. They would stop to breathe. They would be suffocated by carbon dioxide or fried by cosmic rays, etc. The reaction to weightlessness will be terrifying, wrote the German physicist Heinz Haber. The astronaut will feel the sensation of falling into a bottomless pit and will desperately look for a foothold. We cannot exclude that something similar to seasickness will quickly render all crew members incapacitated. Other doctors thought a man wouldn't be able to swallow. Astronaut Walter Schirra said that to disprove them, a NASA technician started drinking a martini upside down. Much harder to do than in zero gravity. If we want to give credit to the Russian sources that have had access to the archives made public, or almost public, in recent years, the blacklist of incidents that actually occurred at the beginning of the Soviet space age appears much richer in episodes, all promptly hidden by the regime's censorship. Maybe it was better that way. It was very likely that if the Russians had decided to abandon their space program following these incidents, astronautics would have never even developed. The United States, in fact, would have had no motivation, neither political nor economic, to continue a race that had already been won by abandoning the opponent. Paradoxically, in this case, the reluctance of the Soviet Union to admit its mistakes proved to be fortunate for everyone. However, in April 1965, even the prestigious, once, Reader's Digest dealt with the rumors filtered through the Iron Curtain. There is a sinister possibility, wrote the famous science journalist John Ratcliffe, that some long-dead Russian cosmonauts are still silently orbiting in space at thousands of miles per hour, victims of Soviet missile launches gone bad, with bodies perfectly preserved from frost. They could wander alone in the cosmos for centuries to come. After all, the rumors had been going around for a long time. In 1959, the famous German physicist Hermann Oberth, a pioneer in rocketry, revealed that in 1958, a cosmonaut launched in a suborbital flight from the Kapustin Yar Cosmodrome had died, but did not want to report the source. In December of the same year, the Italian agency Continental gave the news that, according to a senior exponent of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, 3 Soviet cosmonauts had so far been dead in as many suborbital flights. The rumors were also fueled by photographs of men in spacesuits published in 1959 by the Soviet weekly Oganek. The names of these men appeared in the captions, but it later turned out that they had never taken part in spaceflights. Therefore, proponents of the theory of lost cosmonauts believed that they had died in the course of the secret space missions. On May 15, 1960, while in the Soviet Union, the writer Robert Heinlein was informed by a cadet of the Red Army that on the same day the Soviets had launched a cosmonaut into orbital flight, but that a malfunctioning of the rear rockets had caused the loss of the capsule upon its return to Earth. On April 10, 1961, 2 days before Gagarin's flight, journalist Dennis Ogden, a correspondent for the British communist newspaper The Daily Worker, wrote that a few days earlier, exactly on April 7, 1961, the Soviets had launched a man into space. At the news, a French correspondent in Moscow, Edward Brabowski, the next day mentioned the name of Vladimir Ilyushin. According to some sources, the alleged widow of Anatoly Shtakov was one of the mysteriously disappeared cosmonauts during a visit to the United States with a Soviet delegation, to which he was a part, revealed that her husband died in 1967 during training for a spaceflight. Other sources report instead that Takov would have been the husband of the alleged cosmonaut Lyudmila Sarakovna, and the couple flew into space together in 1961, losing their life. In 1999, a documentary was produced on the affair, in which it was told that Ilyushin launched before Gagarin made an emergency landing in the territory of the People's Republic of China and was seriously injured. The theory of the lost cosmonauts was also fueled by some radio interception picked up in the skies of Turin by 2 Italian radio amateurs. While probing the sky with radio equipment, the 2 Italians repeatedly intercepted alleged signals and requests for help from the cosmonauts in orbit. There was furious controversy over their story, and for several years, the 2 opposing factions of those who believed in their wiretapping and those who claimed they were banal terrestrial interference clashed. In 2007, the History Channel made and aired Pirates of Space, a documentary that deals in depth with the issue, and which claims that what the 2 brothers from Turin recorded is irrefutable proof that the Soviet Union had lost in orbit before Gagarin a series of cosmonauts who have never been able to return to Earth. Another witness deemed more or less reliable, Fidel Castro, that Castro, who in 1980 was in Russia to attend the launch of the first Cuban cosmonaut, Arnaldo Tamayo Mendez, said he had seen the very secret room of the martyrs with relics of all the perished cosmonauts, many more that had officially been admitted. Moved by this, he added, "There are many heroes who sacrificed their lives at the beginning of the space age." On the day of the cosmonaut, April 12, 2001, the very unsuspected Pravda published disconcerting news. Gagarin was not the first man in space. 3 Soviet pilots had died in previous attempts, says Mikhail Rudenko, chief engineer of the 456 Experimental Projects Office. According to Rudenko, 3 capsules with pilots, Ledovsky, Shaborin, and Mitkov at the controls were launched in suborbital flights from the Kapustin Yar Cosmodrome in 1957, 1958, and 1959. All 3 died during the flight, and their names were never officially disclosed, says Rudenko. And this turned out to be a confirmation of what Hermann Oberth had revealed a few years earlier. The existence of a secret space program could explain the reason for the mysteries surrounding these deaths, and also why, despite the losses, the Russians continued with their quote-unquote official program, in which they paid homage to the missing cosmonauts, complete with funerals of state. In the 1988 book, Uncovering Soviet Disasters, Exploring the Limits of Glasnost, NASA engineer and historian James Oberg reports that the first official victim, although only recognized in 1986, was Valentin Bondarenko on March 23, 1961. 3 weeks before Gagarin's flight, Bondarenko died horribly, tortured after a fire in an oxygen-filled pressurized chamber used for training. He burned alive for several minutes and eventually died after 16 hours of agony, stuffed with painkillers. On November 1, 1962, Peter Dolgov died while trying to jump with a parachute from 28,000 meters. The first Soviet cosmonauts, including Gagarin, were all trained to jump from the capsule before landing. In fact, the same agency TASS reported in 1967 the deaths in previous years of as many as 11 cosmonauts, but all during parachute drills from great heights. The only solution was to let the oxygen out slowly, while I was trying to push myself inside a few centimeters at a time. I could feel my temperature rise dangerously, and a flow of heat rising from my feet to my legs and arms. due to the immense physical effort of that maneuver. Everything turned out to be much slower than I assumed. Even when I finally managed to stuff everything into the airlock, I had to perform another almost impossible feat, writhing, to reach the outer component door and close it. After 23 minutes, I came back soaked in sweat and my heart went crazy. From the moment that Leonov's mission seemed at risk, all transmissions from the spacecraft, broadcast by radio and TV, were abruptly suspended. In their place, state radio repeatedly broadcast Mozart's Requiem. At the time, it was customary in the Soviet Union to play solemn music after the death of an eminent figure. But before the official announcement was made, the return to Earth was in a wolf-infested forest, where the two lit a fire to warm themselves. Precisely because no one knew what they would find upon their return, all Soviet cosmonauts were armed with guns. On April 24th, 1967, Oberg continues in uncovering Soviet disasters. Cosmonaut Vladimir Kamarov was killed when the parachute from his Soyuz 1 capsule twisted on its way back to Earth. Years later, Viktor Yevzikov, an engineer who had collaborated in designing the capsule's heat shield, emigrated to America and wrote his memoirs. He said, "The technicians knew that the vehicle was not yet fully developed, but the party ordered the launch despite 4 preliminary attempts having failed. Serious problems hit the ship almost immediately, and at one point, Kamarov, furious, exclaimed, 'Damn machine, there isn't a single command that works.' Kamarov's death sparked a fury of rumors, and the most gruesome is that his screams of agony were recorded by American monitoring stations. According to this account, he knew he was already doomed while still in orbit and had heartbreaking talks with his wife, Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin, and his fellow astronauts. When the deadly plunge towards Earth began, he signaled the temperature rising, then he started screaming. But what was Kamarov doing in orbit? On April 22nd, the UPI news agency reported that within 48 hours, the Russians would attempt their greatest feat, the coupling between 2 spacecraft during flight and the passage of men from one to the other. According to astronaut Buzz Aldrin's book, Men from Earth, the reason for the Soviets' haste is that the flight absolutely had to be completed by May Day. A second capsule was already ready for launch with 3 men, 2 of whom were to make the spacewalk, and the countdown had even begun. But things had gotten so bad that Kamarov could not even maintain continuous radio contact or maintain flight altitude. After running out of fuel and also running out of electricity, he attempted an emergency landing. Virtually nothing remained of him, just a shapeless lump. Over 10,000 people went on pilgrimage to the site of the disaster. Kamarov may have had a premonition of his fate, Time wrote. Just before the cosmonaut entered the spacecraft, he handed a colleague the book he was reading, a biography of Joan of Arc. In the part describing the Maid of Orleans burning at the stake, Kamarov had underlined the following passage. He said his goodbyes and continued to stare at the clear blue sky until the last second, when the black smoke darkened that sky forever. Death also awaited Yuri Gagarin. He was the reserve pilot for the Kamarov mission. And sometime later, on March 27, 1968, he crashed aboard a MiG-15. In the book, Red Star in Orbit, Oberg writes that on January 22, 1969, other Soviet cosmonauts risked perishing in a very unusual way, in an attack on Brezhnev during a parade. As the cars slowly entered the Kremlin, a young lieutenant named Viktor Ilyin drew 2 pistols and fired on one of the cars. His target was Brezhnev, but the car he hit was full of cosmonauts. To save them from the 8 shots fired was certainly the training to react quickly. The driver was hit several times and died shortly after. In the back seat, Nikolaev, Beregovoy, and Leonov pushed Valentina Tereshkova down and shielded her as they were showered with broken glass. Ilyin, meanwhile, had been grabbed by the guards. The ceremony proceeded as if nothing had happened. According to the Moscow News, Ilyin was questioned by Brezhnev's successor himself, the then head of the KGB, Andropov, who sent himself to a psychiatric clinic for 20 years. Just a few days earlier, on January 18th, the Soyuz 5 with astronaut Boris Volynov on board had risked destruction while re-entering the atmosphere. Volynov, Oberg said in 2002, was returning to Earth alone after the space rendezvous with Soyuz 4, to which he had transferred 2 other men, but something went wrong. The command module was unable to separate completely from the descent module. It took mission control only a few moments to realize that nothing could be done. The capsule's heat shield was at the base of the descent module, which was now blocked by the massive command module. Without the shield, a temperature of 5,000 degrees would have incinerated the capsule and the pilot. At mission control, one of the officers took off his cap, put 3 rubles in it, and passed it to the others. Gradually, he filled himself with money for the poor man's family. It had already happened on the day of Kamarov's death. Other flight controllers, knowing they were completely helpless, covered their faces with their hands. As the spacecraft fell back into the atmosphere, Oberg continues, it spun slowly from one end to the other, wrapping all its parts in a ball of fire. Volynov lost radio contact with the surface. He heard the service module's overheated fuel tanks explode, and as flames engulfed the descent module, he saw it filled with smoke. Since he wasn't wearing a spacesuit, he felt the heat on his skin. Volynov was now convinced he had only a few seconds to live, but he heard a crash and the module tumbled violently again. Miraculously, it assumed the right orientation, with the shield pointing downwards. Any mechanical failure had prevented the separation of the 2 modules. The jolt of the return had solved the problem. The capsule landed 2,000 kilometers from the designated point, and in the impact, although muffled by the snow, Volynov broke several teeth, and he found himself with the reverse problem. Since it was the middle of winter and it was negative 38 degrees outside, he was afraid of dying of cold before they found him. Then he went out and set off, spitting blood until he saw a wisp of smoke and ran into a farmer who helped him. As far as is known, Volynov is the only man that has ever survived an accident of this kind. The most serious official catastrophe of the Soviet space program occurred on June 30th, 1971, when the 3 cosmonauts aboard the Soyuz 11, which detached from the orbital station of Soyuz 1 after 24 days, perished upon their return to Earth. Throughout the month of June, says Red Star in Orbit, the TV had broadcast live nighttime connections with the 3 cosmonauts. The men told jokes, did somersaults, and showed their home in space. The Soyuz space station was a real innovation and flew well before Skylab, its American counterpart. The 3 space settlers became the most beloved heroes after Gagarin and Tereshkova. Volkov had even become the idol of little girls. Then the return was ordered. Imagine the scene. The capsule lands softly in a cornfield, followed by the helicopters. There was some perplexity. The onboard radio doesn't seem to work, but people open the hatch with enthusiasm. The first to enter, probably a doctor, greets and prepares to shake hands. There's no answer. The men remain inert, tied to their seats. Embarrassment turns to horror as the doctor checks their pulses. 3 times, and 3 times he feels nothing. It was soon discovered that they had suffocated. Air had exited the capsule through a broken valve, and the men weren't wearing spacesuits. They didn't even have one on board. Upon returning to the atmosphere, the air was back, but it was too late to save the cosmonauts. They had become the first human beings to die in space. It was an impossible case. The valve could not be opened even manually. Yet, it happened. After 110 seconds of detachment from Soyuz, they were already dead. Since then, the use of overalls has been made mandatory. On July 12th, Time wrote, "In Russia, where cosmonauts have now become the popular heroes of the 20th century, the whole nation is in tears." The Soviet leaders sent condolences to the families of the 3 deceased, all married and with children, and called a day of national mourning. Despite the tragic demise, the mission that had officially led to the deaths of the first humans in space had been a complete success, and they made a series of enormous progress. Both aboard the huge Soyuz and Soyuz capsule docked to it, all systems seemed to be working perfectly. In the last week, before the cosmonauts were ordered to move the Soyuz and return to Earth, there had been no cause for concern. The cause of the accident was initially kept a secret, but the Western experts quickly figured out what had happened. It was enough to see the photos of the corpses. However, for a long time there was talk of a fire on board that had caused an emergency evacuation. In the British Communist Evening News, a certain Victor Louis wrote that the crew had simply badly closed the hatch. Indeed, from space, via radio, Volkov's words were clearly heard. Door not hermetically closed? What is happening? What happens? As if they were reacting to a sudden illumination of a warning light or alarm. By a twist of fate, they were then able to close it again, but too late when the cabin was now depressurized. On April 5th, 1975, continues Obergen, uncovering Soviet disasters, listing other incidents. 2 cosmonauts aboard the Soyuz 18-1 crashed into the Altai Mountains due to an aborted launch just after departure. Pilot Vasily Lazarev and engineer Oleg Markarov survived a terrifying descent at 20 G and then tumbled onto the side of a mountain and got entangled in some bushes just before plunging into a precipice. We heard no sound but our gasps and grunts, Lazarev said. They were worried about ending up in China and being interned, but after an hour they were discovered by locals who spoke Russian. In 1996, it was admitted that, in fact, as they feared, the 2 had ended up in Mongolia. Lazarev sustained internal injuries and never flew again, but was allowed to narrate his adventure to the newspapers in 1983. Much to their surprise, the same newspaper published a whole series of articles entitled Orbits of Courage, which with incredible honesty dealt with other narrowly avoided disasters. The second article, Oberg continues, provided a detailed account of the Soyuz 33 mission in spring of 1979. When a 2-man capsule was nearly lost in orbit, the main engine of the spacecraft exploded, and it was feared that it had also damaged the emergency engine. The 2 cosmonauts on board, a Russian and a Bulgarian, took it with resignation, believing they were already condemned. They uncorked a bottle of cognac and drank it. In the third episode, space veteran Vladimir Shatilov, chief of the cosmonauts, recounted the unexpected night emergency landing of the Soyuz 23 with 2 crewmen in a salty lake in Central Asia in 1976. Later, in 1984, another lengthy article provided further details. During the hours spent in the frozen lake, the men were in grave danger of drowning or freezing, as extremely difficult weather conditions prevented rescue helicopters from reaching them. The fourth episode was that of cosmonaut Vladimir Titov, who described in detail the failure of his Soyuz T-8 to dock with the Salyut 7 space station and the risk of collision. On June 3, 1973, Vladimir Bondarenko, who apparently had not yet participated in any space mission, met the same fate as Gagarin at the Parisian airport of Le Bourget while demonstrating the Tupolev 144 supersonic transport plane. Then, there's a story that has an incredible, almost a curse. First, on August 18, 1988, Alexander Shukin died at the controls of a Sukhoi 26 aerobatic plane. Later, on September 9, 1990, Riamontas Stankiewicz crashed into the ground aboard a Sukhoi 27 in Italy during an exhibition in Treviso. Well, Shukin and Stankiewicz had both been designated pilots of the Buran space shuttle, and their disappearance perhaps contributed to the abandonment of the project. It seems that the cosmonauts who died in trivial plane crashes were even dozens. It must also be said that for many of the cosmonauts sighted, dead or not, the Soviet regime was often used as the damnatio memoriae of deletion from official photographs. For some, to hide their belonging to the space program as protagonists of accidents or failures, and for others, because they were not deemed worthy to appear. The Soviets were in fact extremely demanding in the morale quantities and technical skills that those who'd be later celebrated as a national hero must have, and anyone who had behaviors or disorders that were not in line with the image that the Soviet regime wanted to give of himself was promptly removed from the program and historical record. An example for all, Grigory Nelyubov, the man who should have flown in Gagarin's place and who, out of disappointment, ended up ruining his life until he lost it under a train in 1966. Some don't believe these stories and say that the archives of those years were opened without revealing much more than what was already known. But with so many recordings lost or destroyed in the 1990s, and with such a long culture of secrecy behind us, it's unlikely we'll ever have the official truth about those damn tragic and beautiful years.